Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Let's start with a prayer, and then I'll introduce today's session, and then we all get a treat. But let's pray first. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Holy and loving God, thank you for journeying with us our whole lives long, and for revealing yourself to us in moments of need and in moments of celebration, in relationships, in full times, and peaceful, quiet ones. Open our ears and our minds and our lives to be receptive to your Holy Spirit, that we might be shaped by your abiding presence until we reflect your glory to the world. Through Christ our Lord, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
I'm going to start with a couple of introductory comments because, as y'all know, transitioning from the 8:45 service to the Sunday school hour takes a little bit of time, and so that'll give some of our latecomers a chance to trickle in. So bear with me for a moment or two, and then we have two guests with us, as you can tell. But let me remind you where we've been in this series. If this is your first Sunday morning in this Rule of Life series, don't worry. You have picked the right one to come for. And what we will do today does not necessitate your participation in the earlier sessions. But we've been on, so far, a 3-week journey through a rule of life. And my invitation to us is to recognize that each of us has a rule of life. Some of us have taken the time and the intention about expressing it verbally, either in writing or in conversation with others. And others of us have rules of life that we might not even be aware of. And the rule of life that we have is that general guiding way, that habit that shapes our life in daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly ways. I hope that as we journey through this series together, that you have felt an invitation to become intentional about your rule of life, or if you already have an intentional rule of life, an invitation to renew that rule, renewing your commitment to it and reviewing that. We talked about what is a rule of life, that gentle guide. We talked about ways that we can write our own rule of life, ways that we might receive from God, whether it's in silence, whether it's in study, whether it's in conversation or meditation or prayer. We've talked about ways that we can give to God, whether it's through worship, through service, through how we spend our money, how we spend our relationships. And through it all, the invitation has been for you to begin that work of thinking, I wonder what my rule of life is like, or I wonder how my rule of life might again be updated. The fourth session in our series is today, and in theory, the topic is ways to maintain that rule of life, ways to be accountable to our rule of life. And there are several of those, which we will not talk about today, like writing in a journal every day, or having a small group of friends who join you in a rule, or entering a monastic community where you don't get to write your own rule, it is written for you, and it will be enforced every day. And a lot of other ways that we might maintain and return to our rule. But the other way among those is spiritual direction. And that's why I'm delighted that Cheryl Sharman and Kay Bernard, who are both spiritual directors in our congregation and in our community, while they're with us, I'm thankful that they're with us today because they're going to tell us a little bit about spiritual direction. And hopefully, as we leave today, we will have felt a sense of all the different, at least some of the different pieces that might come together for a rule of life. And the invitation is, of course, for that continued work and that continued conversation after today. Look at all those people trickling. Isn't that lovely? We're glad that y'all are trickling in. Let me start by asking our guests to introduce themselves. And as they introduce themselves, to tell us not only their name, but also how long they've been a part of the St. John's congregation in one way or another, and also how long they've been practicing as spiritual directors. And then we'll come back to more about what is spiritual direction and why maybe they pursued it. But let me ask them to introduce themselves, please. Starting with Cheryl, is that all right?
Sure. Can you guys hear me? So I was just telling Kay that the first word of the Benedictine rule, is listen. So a lot of spiritual directors are less comfortable speaking than listening. So if I forget my name somewhere along the process or what I'm trying to say, you guys can come see me one-on-one where I'm much more capable of remembering information. So I'm Cheryl Sharman. I have been in Fayetteville and at St. Paul's for 5 years. I did my spiritual direction training in Los Angeles. I lived in New York City for 15 years before that. I was a writer and researcher for 20 or so years. I still get involved in social justice research involving inequality, homelessness, race, gender, things like this. So that was my previous life, and it forms a big part of the kind of practice that I offer as a spiritual director. So I specialize in trauma, loss, grief, mental illness, race, gender, sexuality, all the things like that.
Thank you. Kay?
Hey, my name is Kay Bernard. Moved to Fayetteville in 2001, and at that time I became a member of St. Paul's. I just finished a 3-year program in spiritual direction in Houston at the Spiritual Direction Institute, where I was certified. And as the years went by, I became a Benedictine Oblate at St. Scholastica Monastery in Fort Smith. And subsequently to that, they started a program in spiritual direction there. So I took their 5-year certification program and started, but I started practicing here at St. Paul's from the moment I came in. Lowell offered me some space to be here, and so for the last 19 years, I've been doing spiritual direction in Fayetteville.
Thank you. One of the things that led to this entire series on Rule of Life, and in particular this conversation about spiritual direction, was a vestry meeting that we had several months ago where I was talking about spiritual direction, and someone on the vestry looked at me and said kind of quietly, "Do we do that?" And that didn't surprise me in the one sense, because the label spiritual direction sometimes takes a little unpacking. But it did, on the other hand, surprise me, because St. Paul's is a church that prides itself on spiritual formation and spiritual practice. But that recognition, and the voice that shared that was not the only person on the vestry who didn't really understand what spiritual direction is. And so what a great opportunity for us to spend some time talking about that. I'm curious, Cheryl and Kay, if you would both tell us a little bit about what is spiritual direction as you understand it, and as you answer that, if you'll also help us hear a little bit about what spiritual direction isn't.
Okay, sure. So spiritual direction is, I think, a misnomer. I think spiritual direction, I don't direct anything when I meet with someone. I think it's more, a more appropriate word is spiritual companionship, because what I'm doing is, as she said, as Cheryl was saying, I'm sitting in communion with another soul that's on a soul journey, and we are listening for the way that God moves in their lives. So, there's a lot of different ways and reasons people come to spiritual direction, but a lot of times, I'll try to remember some of the people that have come to me. A lot of people are discerning for the priesthood or the diaconate. A lot of people are going through some kind of grief or loss, and they need someone to talk through that with. A lot of people just want to get closer to God and want different ways, want someone to help them understand different ways to pray and different methods of doing that, how to get there. So those are some of the ways that I think spiritual direction is. What it is not is therapy. It is not pastoral care, and it differs in that way. And I have had people come to me before that I have told them I didn't feel qualified to work with them because they needed therapy, and what I do is not therapy. So that's a real fine line and distinction that I hold with people. For the last 20 years, I've been a member of Spiritual Directors International, which is kind of the governing board. It's out of Washington State, and they have ethical guidelines that we go by, and I try to form my practice under those guidelines. So I'm real clear about what I can do and what I can't do with people.
Thank you. Cheryl, what might you add to that?
I'm so glad you mentioned Spiritual Directors International because I would have forgotten that. But one of the things I love about spiritual direction is that we have a code of ethics that requires us to be in spiritual direction and in supervision, which I don't often find replicated across all the healing professions. So we have people that we are accountable to all the time, at least monthly, about our ongoing spiritual work in ourselves and the work that we do with clients, which is the only container into which we can share confidential things with our supervisors. I would also add that I have a huge portion of my clients are spiritual but not religious. So with my more religious, more orthodox clients, we may work on the rule of life or prayer or more specific things like that. With my spiritual but not religious clients, I have a certification in, I know Kay has more than I do in the Enneagram, but in sand tray work, and I have clients in and out of homelessness and incarceration. So one of them refers to me as his bartender without the alcohol. So I think that it's just about providing a listening presence and we try to have the most vast toolbox we possibly can to meet people where they are. My clients, I was a writer and researcher, so I tend to be a cerebral introvert. I have a lot of cerebral introvert clients for whom books and resources are the primary way that the holy enters their lives. So I spend a lot of time, I do private custom retreats where they'll say, this is the most meaningful book right now in my life ever. Can you please read it and talk to me specifically about where God is meeting me in that space?
Thank you. Other than the fact that you name for us that spiritual direction isn't always religious, what are some other ways that spiritual direction is different from the kind of pastoral care you might get from your priest or your clergy person? How if somebody comes to you in a moment of grief, how might the spiritual director's role be different from the role of a pastor in responding to that grief?
That's a really good question. It seems like there's some overlap in that, of course, we're not clergy, so we can't provide what clergy can. But what I do with people is just try to meet them where they're at in that process. And over the years, it seems like, what I've learned the most is that grief happens differently for everybody. And it takes as long as it takes for a person. I sit there and try to be a listening presence. I try to resource them with books and counsel on grief. But other than that, I can't really say that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a ministry of presence in both cases, so they're very similar. Yeah, thank you. Cheryl, in some ways, how do you distinguish what you offer from what a clergy person might offer?
I think the long-term aspect is a huge piece that Evan can't possibly meet with every parishioner long-term over everything that happens, and we theoretically can. Part of our ethics for Spiritual Directors International is not to take on too many clients so that we maintain that presence, that deep, abiding, holy presence for as many as we take on. But we have the ability to be with you in your grief 2 years later on the anniversary of that death, or as it creeps up. I also lead a monthly grief gathering in the community, which is ongoing because there's no other, and this is the difference between counseling, right? So counselors offer 8 to 10 week structured sort of get past your most recent loss, but spiritual direction can offer an ongoing container into which your grief is welcome when your friends and family may not have the patience 2 or 3 or 15 years in. You can show up to us and we have the space for it.
Thank you. Yeah, a mentor of mine once, and I think y'all heard me say this in a meeting we had before today, but a mentor of mine once invited me to think of every pastoral encounter as spiritual direction, in the sense that it's not my job to fix it or to be your therapist. It's my job to be with you. However, I kind of anticipate that we might be together 2 or 3 times in response to a particular crisis or an issue, and although spiritual direction sometimes begins in a moment of crisis or loss, often spiritual direction just begins as that desire, and I think it was Kay who said just a desire to get closer to God. And if it begins, whether it begins in that way or if it begins in that more general or that more specific response to a crisis, the invitation is to see how this might continue. Whereas I'm kind of thinking, all right, we've got 2 chances to kind of sit and visit about that, and then I'm making a referral either to a therapist, because it seems that you might need therapy, or to a spiritual director who can journey with you for that long journey. Yeah. And have y'all ever had the experience of referring a person to a clergy person, or in another way coordinating the care that you offer with the care someone is receiving from a clergy person, either explicitly or just implicitly in your spiritual direction?
Absolutely have referred people on to clergy for certain things. And I just want to add something to this discussion, is that spiritual direction came about because there was a decrease in the amount of clergy and the reduction in the amount of nuns. A lot of times in the past, it was in the Roman Catholic Church where spiritual direction was born and had been practiced for centuries. I just was reading an article in one of my Presence magazines, which is the SDI publication, the Spiritual Directors International, and they were saying that, it's only in the last couple of decades that the Protestant religions have been taking on spiritual direction as a practice or something that's viable. So that's why spiritual direction has been becoming more of a profession, if you will, for the last 20 to 30 years, is in particular. More and more people have been trained. And like when I was in Houston training those 3 years in 1998 and on, there were people from all faiths and all traditions that were training. It was a lot of interfaith worship. We were all learning from each other about everybody's religion. So just to say that that's how it all came about.
Thank you. Any other examples, Cheryl, about coordinating with a clergy person?
Yes, with a given client's permission, I often coordinate both with their therapist and with their clergy. We all have different hats to wear in that space, so if someone has encountered grief and they want to know where is God in that, then they first see their priest and then they come to me for longitudinal support. But if that has led them, sorry for the cough and the mic, if that has led them into a serious period of depression or triggered made some mental illness that was pre-existing worse, then their therapist needs to be involved in that. And with their permission, I'm in contact with both the clergy and the therapist on a regular basis about how to provide the safest container and the best healing for that client.
Thank you. Would both of you talk a little bit about rule of life and the ways in which you have found a rule of life to be spiritually beneficial, either to you as an individual or to those with whom you offer or share spiritual direction, and to what extent does it play a role in your practice, and how does it fit in? How does, as a spiritual director, how does a rule of life fit in with not only your practice of spiritual direction, but also with those you see, or if you are interested in sharing some of your own experiences?
So I've been practicing the rule of life of the Benedictines for many years as an oblate. And so I go by the rule of Benedict, and part of what I do is once a month we have Oblate Sunday at the monastery. So I go there and we meet with other oblates and we work together. So that's been part of my rule of life. But a bigger part of my rule of life personally has been my own prayer life. I have an immense prayer life, and I think some of you would be surprised to know how much I pray. It's just something that's very important to me. I recently joined the Daughters of the King because I met a group out of Hot Springs that were daughters, and their prayer life was so intense. And I just thought, well, I think that can enhance what I'm doing in my own prayer life. So I have certain rituals I do every day and every evening with my prayer life. I have certain literature that I get that I have sent to me that I pray with. When I meet with someone, that's the first thing we talk about in our opening session is, what is your prayer practice? What is your daily, how do you meet God daily? What is God to you? How do you define God? What do you call God? these are all questions. And then we kind of tailor the time that we have together over, we meet once a month typically, unless they feel the need to meet more than that. Sometimes in the beginning I'll meet every 2 weeks. Someone I just started with has asked me to meet every 2 weeks. So I'll do that. But I find out where they're at, and then we go from there. And we take what they're doing, and we try to enhance it based upon what they need. Some people don't like to journal, for instance, but we find another way to do what they want to do. And so we just, we pick up tools from a toolbox, if you will, and tailor make it for each individual person that's coming.
Yes. One of the things I love about the Benedictine rule is that it was meant to be nothing harsh, nothing burdensome, everything in context. So it seems so onerous and huge and intimidating, but it's really meant to be broad enough to encompass what everyone living in that community needed. And of course, Benedict had been a hermit at Subiaco before that, so it takes into account those of us who need deep solitude, which for me is a huge piece of my rule of life. That overall, I have a period, a sort of rhythm that goes from reflection to action to reflection, so that I always have space to reflect after the action. And on a daily basis, I have a rhythm that is solitude, action, solitude. So I build in 30 minutes between clients so that I have space to recenter myself between what was going on with them, or to give them more time, and then to recenter myself before the next person, so that it's not that person's previous session isn't clouding what's going on now with this new, holy, unique individual that has something in their life that they need to share.
What are some ways that, if, in particular, Cheryl, because I think I hear that some of your clients might not have a rule of life, or at least call it a rule of life. Are there ways in which those spiritual but not religious clients are that you engage them, or at least you invite them to think about that daily? How might I'm looking for some language or some examples of ways to think about rule of life as something more than something a monk wrote down a while ago, or something my priest told me to do. Help me understand rule of life as something even broader than that, the way that you might engage someone who's not religious.
So I think that's one of my favorite spaces to occupy, because the rule of life is something we're living unconsciously anyway, right? So whether or not we get up every day and run, or eat breakfast, or get to work at this particular time, or call our mother or granddaughter this often, those are all things that we're doing. So with clients who don't use that, and you may notice that I refer to them as clients. Some very typical spiritual directors refer to them as directees. But in that whole thing that Kay lined out about how we aren't directing, we are accompanying, I tend to refer to people as clients instead. So with a client who isn't comfortable with God, language, or practices, we talk in terms of spacious structure, that we want to build in structure for what is important, but we want it to be spacious enough to not feel oppressive. So if you get home from work and you have on your rule of life that 5 minutes after arriving home you're going to be in your prayer room, then it's not building in a lot of spaciousness and a lot of what Thoreau would refer to as a broad margin to your life. Having the space to watch the birds for 30 minutes, or watch a sunset, go for a walk. So these are things that my clients who maybe don't attribute those things to God, they're maybe willing to call them holy or divine. We want to make sure that they have the spacious structure to make sure that weekly Sunday morning walk, if that's their church, it doesn't get eschewed for catching up on work or folding more laundry, unless the folding of the laundry can be a quotidian practice too. So,
thank you. Both of y'all, if you'd share with us a little bit about why might someone who's been through this series and who's thinking about a rule of life, why engage a spiritual director? You've talked about what is spiritual direction, and maybe what I'm just asking is kind of a distillation in some ways of what you've discussed. But if someone said to you, why do I need a spiritual director? Or need might be too strong a word. Like how might a spiritual director help me? And how would I know whether spiritual direction would be something that I might benefit from? How might you answer that?
Well, whenever someone approaches me about spiritual direction, I try to go into it without any type of expectation or ego consciousness, if you will, just to be open to them where they are and not worry about if they want to come to me or not. Just trying to hear where they are in their lives. And I actually tell people, you know, you might want to try this a time or two before you decide if we're going to really work together, because it's so important. I think spiritual direction is much more of an intimate relationship, because you're sharing your soul journey with someone. You're not just talking about, you know, life in general. You're really getting, if you're doing spiritual direction, you're really trying to get deeper into your life, into your inner life. And so I invite them to just be open to see if it's a fit. And I try not to let my personal feelings of, you know, like, I try not to feel any kind of rejection if they don't feel like it's a fit. You know, that's not what it's about. It's about being there and sharing God together. And so why would you come? I think it's mostly accountability. If people have, a lot of people don't want to get into their inner lives. But if you really want to delve deeper into your inner life, then it's a benefit to have somebody walking that path with you. You don't have to do it alone. So a lot of existential questions come up. A lot of deep thought goes into any spiritual direction session. So it's just being accountable to someone else. And it just kind of keeps you on your toes, I think. It keeps you in the process. And it keeps you knowing that it's almost like weaving a tapestry. You're pulling a thread through. And that's what I'm listening for as I meet with people, is what is the thread that is coming through in the life? How are we weaving this together with God? Because God is the director, I'm not.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Yes. Can we just do that? Whatever Kay says. So I think accountability is a huge piece of why people come to us. I think I have a lot of clients who are clergy, so I don't think they so much need the accountability as much as the confidential container into which they can pour real life, which they, you know, as parishioners, that's not our role, but as a spiritual director to clergy, that is my role, to give them a space for confidentiality. I think another thing that we don't have enough of in life is a pure hour to talk about us, where we're just pouring that out and it's not landing on anyone else. You know, if you say, oh, I believe that I've discerned that God wants me to move to Haiti tomorrow, your partner, your children, your employers, these people are all implicated by this decision, and the way they respond to you is going to come out of their natural human reaction to whatever you've just revealed. We are going to stay completely neutral and tease that out as if you've ever studied improv comedy, it's a yes and process. So we're going to play a yes and process with you of what would that look like, and how is God asking you to do that, and what sort of readiness are you making in your prayer life, and not at all implicated by this decision, just totally a neutral, confidential container into which you can put these things. And another thing is there are so many overwhelmingly fantastic resources out there, even for the Rule of Life, dozens and dozens and dozens of books. We spend our days in this space, so we know which book might be the best fit for you based on whether you like a lot of structure, whether you like, a very tiny little bit of structure. Whichever is sort of more you, we can sort of target things in our toolbox specifically for you.
Hearing about that confidentiality and that container, you touch on some boundaries. How do you, confidentiality might not need explanation. It might, I don't know. But when you are in the store or at a dinner table or somewhere else and you bump into one of your clients, what are some ways that you maintain, not only for your sake, but also for the sake of those to whom you offer spiritual direction? What are some of the examples of boundaries that you set for yourself and that person that help sort of reinforce that container?
What I do is I try to set it up right from the get-go that this is a relationship that we establish together in this space, and that outside of this, we're not necessarily friends, okay? We are going very deep with each other, but I try not to become a friend of someone that I do direction with. And I have had, and I still have, people that have come to me before, because I've been doing this almost 20 years, that still keep in touch with me. And we become friends afterwards. But in the process, we never have the friendship going at that time. Lost my train of thought.
So the relationships outside of the practice
Yeah.
reflect the practice itself.
Yeah, in Fayetteville, it's hard not to run into people that you direct. So what I do is if I see them outside of direction, I'll say hi to them, but I'll never reveal to anyone that I have a relationship with them in spiritual direction. If they want to cop to that, that's their decision. Some people will say, somebody else will walk up to us and they'll say, oh, this is my spiritual director, and that's fine with me, but I will never reveal that information unless they want to reveal it first. That's just sacrosanct. Just doesn't happen.
Thank you. Cheryl, any other ways that you keep boundaries or invite others to?
I think mine are more extreme than that for reasons that we'd have to spend another hour on the Enneagram. But I think because I see a lot of people, like let's say clergy from different denominations, that I don't even say hi to them when I run into them in public because their tradition sometimes doesn't value spiritual direction, and I don't even want them to have to explain what that is and why they're coming for it. I see a lot of remote clients, so that is sometimes easier to maintain boundaries. Obviously, I don't run into them in the grocery store. When I run into you, if you're a client and I don't say hi, I don't ever want you to be offended. So I have a 6 or 7 page covenant that I have people read before we ever begin work together, and it includes things like that around if we want to be friends, we discontinue this relationship and we move into the friend realm.
Yes, so both of you have those kind of, and set those expectations up front so that
Yes.
it provides healthy relationships. You both kind of touch on it. There's a difference between a friend and a spiritual director. How frustrating would it be if every time we came to our friend with our challenges, the friend said, "That's interesting. Tell me more about that." We need a friend to react. We need a friend to feel with us. We need a spiritual director who can practice that yes and, practice that container, practice giving us the space to explore that and to journey with us instead of jumping into our boat and kind of letting our problems become their problems. That's great for a friend, not as good for a spiritual director in that way, so I appreciate that. In just a minute, I'm going to ask what questions you have, but before I do, let me ask, how does somebody find a spiritual director? Are you taking new clients in your spiritual direction, but not just about you? How might you recommend somebody look for a spiritual director? Is it the Yellow Pages, or where might we look, and how might we know how to engage someone at least the first time?
Well, a good resource is the SDI, the Spiritual Directors Institute, has a worldwide directory. So some people have found me through that over the last few years, and you just go to sdiworld.org, and you can see spiritual directors in all areas of the country and in the world. So that's one way to do it. Another is to know, like, if people practice and they're part of your church, you can get to them through that. I'm currently taking new directees. If anybody is interested, they just have to call my home. It's listed, and or you can call St. Paul's and get a hold of me. I'd be happy to talk to you see if it's a good fit, and see, if you want to explore what spiritual direction is.
Thank you. Cheryl?
Yes, I am taking new clients too. Lately, I've been saying I'm only taking new clients who are willing to do the work, and then we get to spend a lovely conversation about what that work means. It doesn't mean, extensive homework and lots of stress. It just means that you are ready to deeply peel back the layers of the onion that involve your spiritual life, however you define spirit. So I have some really outdated brochures that I dug out of my office and brought today. I can give you those, or some. I have some business cards that don't say spiritual director on them because when I first moved here, people didn't know what that was and kept getting confused. And the nomenclature is so it's not quite only spiritual, it's not quite only director, so it just has my name and your ways to get in touch with me. And then I think, I would just also like to add that it really does feel like dating. It really does feel like the right fit. You need to. I think this is why I have clients all over the world, because they didn't find the people in their geography that. Sorry for the cough. That matched what they needed to know in that moment, what they needed support and walking alongside in that moment. So sometimes they find me like that. So don't feel like you have to restrict your search to us. Spiritual Directors International has a vast network.
Thank you. What questions might you have about spiritual direction or about any rule of life or anything that we've discussed today or anything on your mind? Russell's going to shuttle the microphone from place to place. If this is your first time in our session, we record these and actually broadcast them live on the internet. And so because of that, we ask you to wait until you get your microphone so that we can all hear you, and also so that those who are watching online can hear you. What questions might you have for this group as our bagpipers prepare to go pipe their bags? Yeah. Oh, a question right up here up front. Here we go. Before she goes, wonderful.
That made my day.
So if a person begins with a spiritual director, and if they find a good fit and they begin with that person, and then something happens in the life of the individual that really changes them, is it like you look for a spiritual director that specializes in that kind of trauma or whatever it is, emotional change? I mean, or you stay with the same person and then you kind of work as a team. How does that work?
Well, it works both ways. Some people will stay with the director for years. I've had some people stay with me for years, and other people will come for a certain period of time when they feel like they're in some kind of transformation or sometimes a crisis, and then they'll move on. But it's fine if you want to go to another spiritual director and try somebody else out and see what their skills are. But that's how. I mean, I'm open to working with anybody on anything. I use the Enneagram a lot in my practice, and that's been very helpful to me. I needed to mention that.
Cheryl, what about you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's why I describe it as dating instead of marriage. It has to feel like a great fit, but it's not permanent. So it's up to you to discern. Sometimes if you're encountering internal resistance to what we're inviting you toward, you need to sit with whether you're resisting the thing or you're resisting us, because that's an important distinction. But if you're resisting us, that's perfectly acceptable for you to move on to somebody else. Or if your life changes and you need somebody with a specialization in a different area.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Laura? And then we'll come all the way back up here to the front where you sat, Russell.
It sounds like you have a very strong spiritual discipline to keep you grounded so that you're present for your clients or your spiritual directees. But what sort of accountability do you use for yourself so that you don't project some of your own stuff into those clients?
That's a great question.
Yeah, really good question. Cheryl mentioned it earlier, but what we do is we have our own spiritual director, so that and our own supervisor. And that's one of the ethical guidelines that we render under SDI's guidelines. And so we're meeting with people that help us to see, like after a session, or before supervision, I do a verbatim, we call it, just like psychologists do when they're in training. You do a verbatim and you try to figure out what internally came up in me that I need to process that was triggered by that person that I was working with. And then we process that on our own so that we don't take that and project it in session.
Cheryl?
Yes, and I think one of the things that our supervisors are so invaluable for is if there's a pattern over time that we're not seeing of a way that we're not responding at our best or our most open or our most accommodating, then all of us have blind spots, and our supervisor can be like, you remember that client 3 years ago, and you remember that client a year ago, and now this client today, this is, and I do this with people that I supervise, so that you have a sort of baseline to look at and know this is an area where you may not be the most comfortable working with clients who are in this space, and maybe if you can start to pay attention to that, maybe you need to prayerfully discern whether those clients need to be referred out to somebody else.
Thank you. Tammy.
I have a friend in the Methodist Church who has become a trained Stevens minister. Is that similar to spiritual direction?
It's very similar.
Or what are the similarities and differences?
It's very similar. In my cohort of my training program, we had people who had been trained previously as Stevens ministers, so that was really cool to be able to, for them to articulate muchly what the difference is. It's very similar, except that the confidentiality is the same. There's a lot of similarity, except that we are just a little more engaged. So, like an example would be. We're trying to protect confidentiality and reframe things, but an example would be something that a Stevens minister, because they're not equipped to have this sort of depth of training that we have, they may have to sort of stay more on the sidelines of something that's going really off the rails, and we have a little more authority to push in, not so much to push in a particular direction, but to push in hey, we've been talking about the same thing for 3 years. So we need to kind of discern whether or not you want to stay in this pattern forever, or whether you want to actually kind of move out of this holding pattern.
Thank you. And Stevens ministers are particularly in response to a grief or a loss or a struggle in that way. And often people find spiritual directors because they just want someone to journey with them as they search to be closer to that which is holy or to God.
Yeah, I really want to stress that the ideal scenario is that you come to us not in crisis. Because then we know who you are by the time you reach your crisis, and we know that you used to run every morning, and now in this cataclysmic loss, you're no longer running every morning, and so let's encourage you to get back to that practice that we already knew existed beforehand.
Thank you. Other questions? Got time for a couple more? Yeah, great. Thanks, Gary. And then Barbara.
Yeah, okay. Do we have any Enneagram sessions open to the public that are coming up anytime soon?
We are considering starting a group in January, and I've been trying to talk with the person who's going to do that with me, and she hadn't returned my call all week. So I'm in the process of thinking about that. I'd love to do one for the community as a whole, to just a teaching of the basics. And so maybe I'll set aside a Saturday in the springtime to do that.
We'd love that.
Yeah.
But Kay and I have talked about both of those things. The first is a group of people who have a little bit of knowledge who would like to go deeper on a regular kind of basis. But a day-long teaching, a workshop for anybody would be a wonderful offering in the spring. Thank you. Look for
happy
that,
to.
Gary. Barbara, did you have something? And then behind you. Thank you.
Thank you. And you have pretty well explained some of the differences in what you do with therapy. So I have a question about if you learn of something through your relationship with your clients that perhaps they are in an abusive situation, an abusive relationship, or something like that, what is your ethical responsibility to deal with that, report it, not report it? I don't know.
Fortunately, I've never had that happen. I think if it did happen to me, what I would do first, if it's someone in this church, I would probably go to the clergy first, if it happened that way. If I was aware of their therapist, then I would ask them to work with the therapist and do that referral. I don't think I'm qualified to go deep into something like that, and so I wouldn't take it on, I would refer it.
Thank you. Cheryl?
My answer is very different. Because my specialization is in trauma, grief, loss, mental illness, gender inequality, I hear something like that every day. And I do a lot of work with people in incarceration and homelessness, so I hear that kind of information every day. So if I'm at Seven Hills, I report it to Seven Hills. If I'm at the prison, I report it to the prison. If it's in my private practice, I report it to my supervisor. So there's always a trail, and there's always people feeding back into me of the stream of whatever I'm pouring out, they're pouring into me to make sure, both also in answer to your question, to make sure to support me, because I take in a lot of trauma. I take in a lot of, I do retreats for frontline service providers on burnout and vicarious trauma, and so providing care and space and buffers and distance for providers who hear that kind of thing. So that's where it's harder for me to just be the end of that, because I sometimes know more than the provider I'm reporting it to, just in terms of expertise. But I do, based on SDI ethics, I do make sure that there are always people above me who are getting that information.
Yeah, and I hear that from both of you, but the fact that you often deal with it and Kay hasn't. But yeah,
Right.
we've got time for one more question. Yes.
I think one of you said you had clients all over the world. So I was wondering, are they all in the Episcopal denomination? Are they in different denominations or even different religions like Jewish or Muslim?
Yes,
So
yes.
let's let Cheryl talk about the diversity there, and particularly the fact that she meets with people from all over the world. And then let's also ask Kay about the sort of the nature of the client she meets, and then we'll finish. Cheryl.
Yes. So yes, I see clients all over the world. I didn't mean to do that. I'm not comfortable with a microphone, so I wasn't really comfortable with all the technology there. But a client in Oklahoma, and then a client in overseas, and then a client in Missouri, and then they just started to tell each other, and then now I have them kind of everywhere. And then yes, according to Spiritual Directors International, some of them have found me by searching for subject areas like grief or loss or trauma or sexuality or race. There's not a lot of spiritual directors of color, so it's a huge lack. And so because that's one of my areas of expertise of working with racial inequality, then those people end up finding me. So, and that means, yes, the door is open for every kind of spirituality. So I have professed atheists who are clients who are still seeking meaning and structure within that after the loss of faith, and then the loss of faith as a trauma that they need to heal. And I'll shut up now, but I do all that.
Thank you. Kay, what about you? Are all your clients Christian or people of faith, or how do you approach that?
All of my clients have been people of faith, and well, no, that's not true. I've had a couple that have been spiritual, but spiritual but not religious. I prefer to meet with people face to face. I have been requested to do it online or over email or something, and that's not my choice. So I meet with people one-on-one, and that really works well. And that's how I feel more comfortable. I don't like to take people online. That's just my preference.
So lots of variety, but you can hear beautiful similarities. If you have more questions, share them with me, and I can help get those to Cheryl and to Kay. If you want to know more about how to engage a spiritual director, I bet Kay and Cheryl would both have some ideas about next steps. As you heard, there's some brochures here as well. But let's say thank you to Kay and to Cheryl for being with us today. Thank y'all very much. That's a gift to me and to us. Next week during the Adult Forum, we have a look at sort of an Advent theme, sort of into the world and judgment, and why do other Christians talk about that so differently from the ways we talk about it. Then on the 8th of December, we have an alternative gifts market, and then another session on the 15th, and then Reader's Theater on the 22nd. So during the season of Advent, we've got some variety of offerings. Thank y'all very much.
Can I just make some obnoxious little... you guys know about the Way of Love the Episcopal Church is doing, and if you don't know about it, please find out all about it. It has amazing Advent resources, especially. And I am serving as the spiritual advisor for a project called Her Way of Love, which is a women-specific honoring of the way of love globally around the rule of life, the way of love. I can talk more about that all, but it's all really cool resources that I want you to know about.